So we're going to pick up where we left off talking about the domain eukarya. Remember, there's three major domains: the bacteria and the archaea that make up the prokaryotes, and lastly the eukaryotes. And in these few lectures that we'll be talking about what they are, what traits contribute to their success, when they first appeared on planet Earth, and how they evolved. So when we're talking about the eukaryotes, they are the innovators of the cellular world, and we've talked about some of the traits that they have that contribute to their success in terms of the larger cell size that made way for things like organelles, cytoskeleton and intermembrane system, how their genomic organization of having a nucleus and having linear DNA helps them to code for some of the complex traits that they've evolved. We've talked about the importance for sexual reproduction for introducing genetic variation and new trait combinations into populations of eukaryotes. And today we're going to spend some time talking about multicellularity. So when we talk about multicellularity, it's important to make the distinction between a unicellular organism that consists of only one cell, so the entire organism is just one cell, versus a multicellular organism. So the organism itself is made up of many different cells. So this is a great example over here of a unicellular organism. Each of these little cells here that you're looking at is an individual organism. So these are unicellular organisms that can live independently on their own as one single cell. Now there's different types of multicellularity, one type being simple multicellularity. So when we're talking about simple multicellularity, we're talking about an organism that's comprised of similar cells with little interdependence. So these individual cells don't depend on one another to survive. And most of those cells, when you have simple multicellularity, most of the cells involved in this sort of what's called a colonial organism, they're sort of all connected to each other, but they're also in contact with the environment. And so each of those individual cells can get nutrients directly from the environment and dump out waste into the environment. And each cell, each of these individual cells that makes up this sort of colonial, simple multicellular organism can perform all the cellular functions that they need to survive and reproduce. So in other words, if you broke one of these little cells off and it had to survive on its own, it could. So just to give you an example of a simple multicellular organism, this is a green algae called Prassiola. So Prassiola, it's only one cell thick, and in that way, all of the cells are in direct contact with the environment. So here's an example of Prassiola, and each of these little dots that you're looking at right here is an individual cell. All of those cells are interconnected with one another, but each of those cells can also survive on their own. And you can see that this is a super flat organism. And so the idea here is by being super flat, it's increasing its surface area to volume ratio. It has a very high surface area relative to the volume of all those cells that are connected to one another. And in that way, all the cells have access to the environment for getting nutrients and expelling wastes. And this is another great example of thinking about how the structure of an organism is related to its function. So each of those individual cells that you're looking at in this green algae need to have exposure to the environment to be able to do photosynthesis, to capture light, to produce nutrients and resources and get access to those nutrients and resources, and also to dispel any waste that they have out into the environment. So that flat shape is its structure that's highly related to the function of each of those individual cells. And so if we're comparing simple multicellularity to something called complex multicellularity, which is the multicellularity that probably we normally think of, when we're talking about simple multicellularity, once again, we're talking about cells that are attached to one another, but each of those cells has very, very similar functions in that they don't depend on each other to survive, and each of those cells can carry out all of the functions that they need to do to reproduce, to grow, and to survive. And so they can survive and reproduce independently of one another. So you can think about this Pandorina, this right here are a bunch of individual cells that form these sort of colonies, and you can break these colonies apart, and one of those individual cells can still survive, do all the functions it needs to survive, and reproduce if it needs to. It's just that they do better when they're in these colonies. Now this is in contrast to complex cellularity. So with complex cellularity, it's much more complex than this sort of basic simple multicellularity. With complex multicellularity, basically you have all of these cells in a complex multicellular organism attached to one another, but they have different functions. And these cells individually depend on each other to survive. So if you were to separate them, one cell cannot survive without the other because they can't do all the functions that they need to survive. So these specialized cells carry out very specific functions in a complex multicellular organism, and they can't survive independently. And that often results in things like tissue, so muscle, skin, etc. So just to give you an example of this, we can look at the cells that line a stomach. And here we're looking at some cells here that secrete digestive enzymes and help absorb nutrients in the stomach. So food gets in, these cells decrease a bunch of enzymes or excrete a bunch of enzymes that sort of break down that food and help absorb nutrients into your bloodstream across the stomach lining. Then there's also cells that are in the stomach that are a different type of cell, and this cell secretes mucus that neutralizes stomach acid. And these cells, they're connected to each other, but these cells depend on each other and you and other cells as well to survive. And if you were to put these cells out into the environment on their own, they would die, they wouldn't be able to reproduce. And so they're dependent on each other to function. And the organism as a whole, for example, you, is dependent on these cells to survive as well. And so with complex multicellularity, a great example of a complex multicellular organism are animals, and humans, of course, are animals. And so when you're talking about complex multicellularity, you're talking about organisms that have unique, specialized cell types that form tissues and often organ systems. So we can think about bones making up our skeletal system. We can think about individual neuron cells making up our nervous system. We can think about the cells that make up our circulatory system, the cells that make up our lungs and our pulmonary system. We can think about all the different types of cells that make up our liver, our stomach, our intestines, and our digestive system, or the muscle cells that make up our muscle system. And so all of these things are individual cells that make up these organs, and these cells depend on each other to survive. And furthermore, the organism itself, in this case a human, depends on all of those cells and all of those organs and all of those organ systems to survive and reproduce. If you remove any of those individual systems, the organism can't go on. So if you take your skeleton out, you're not going to do so hot. And that skeleton is not going to survive on its own either. Okay, quick question. In simple multicellularity, typically what? Okay, if you said most cells retain a full range of functions for survival, that is the correct answer. So there is not extensive communication between the cells, or although they are linked to one another, there's not a lot of communication between them. Cells are highly differentiated and specialized. That is also false. This is more something that's common in multicellularity, as is this extensive communication between cells. That's also common in multicellular organisms, as there needs to be communication between the cells for them to interact with one another and to signal when certain cells have to do things and other ones don't. This differentiation and specialization is unique to multicellularity as well. Many cells are not in direct contact with the external environment. That's typically false in simple multicellularity. Typically, most of the cells are in direct contact with the external environment, so they can be exchanging nutrients and waste with the external environment and maintain a high surface area to volume ratio. And the loss of one or more cells usually leads to death of the organism. That is false. That's typically more true of multicellular organisms, although loss of one cell is probably not a big deal, but if you start losing entire organs or big chunks of organs, you're going to be in trouble. Okay, next question. Which is more likely to survive? So the answer to this one is B. A simple multicellular organism that loses a significant portion of its body is probably fine. Because once again, to reiterate, if you have this sort of colonial organism that's made up of a bunch of different cells that individually can survive on their own, if that organism gets split in half, in theory, those cells should still be able to survive on their own. Maybe not as well, but they should still be able to survive. Way more so than if a complex multicellular organism loses an essential organ, like a brain or a heart or something like that. You're not going to do so hot. So when we look at complex multicellularity, in fact, it's evolved independently at least 6 different times in eukaryotic groups. So this is a great example of convergent evolution, where you have different taxa on the tree of eukaryotic, sort of major eukaryotic groups. Complex multicellularity has evolved several times independently, at least 6 different times. So we see it in animals. It's evolved 2 different times in fungi. We've seen it in red algae, in green algae, specifically the land plants, as well as brown algae. And so these are just photos representing those different multicellular groups, whether you're talking about fungi like mushrooms, whether you're talking about animals like this chameleon we see right here, green algae and the land plants, red algae that we're looking at right here, or brown algae right here. These are all examples of complex multicellular organisms. And so if we're seeing this evolve several different times by convergent evolution, that must mean that there's some huge advantages to being a multicellular organism. So what are the advantages of being multicellularity? Why would we see this evolve independently several different times in these major different groups of eukaryotes? And once again, sorry I didn't point this out before, but this tree we're looking at here are the major eukaryotic groups. And so all of these represent all the different major taxonomic groups of eukaryotes, and the blue ones represent those eukaryotic groups that have evolved multicellularity. So let's get back to talking about some advantages of complex multicellularity. So one big advantage is multicellular organisms are bigger, and if you're bigger, you can avoid predation. So if we think about a simple multicellular organism like these colonial organisms here, the idea here is if you can get in a big group and get yourself bigger than these sort of amoeba or other organisms that are capable of phagocytosis, you can make yourself so big that other unicellular predators can't phagocytize you. So there would be selection for these groups that are able to colonize and make these colonies to avoid predation. And at the same time, if you're a really big, complex multicellular organism, you can also have more opportunities to feed. So complex multicellular organisms, like if you're a big, giant fish, you're able to suck down this crawfish. And so being a larger organism gives you opportunities to eat other organisms. In addition, if you're a photosynthetic organism, you can make these long leaves with lots of surface area and things like that, and that can create opportunities to collect lots of sunlight or potentially other nutrients. And so there's advantages to having this large size for feeding opportunities. Another big advantage of multicellularity is multicellular organisms can demonstrate cell differentiation, and that allows for specialization of cells that can perform specialized functions and basically increase the overall efficiency of those organisms. So if these individual cells or groups of cells can become very, very specialized at performing just one specific task, they can be much more efficient at it. And so if we think about eukaryotic organisms starting off as a single-celled zygote, an egg or sperm, that single cell splits and splits and splits and splits, and different genes get turned on within the genomes, within the chromosomes of those organisms to allow those cells to become different cell types. Now, cell types, they can't switch back from one cell to another. Once they become a certain cell type, they're stuck as that cell type. But you can get all of these different individual differentiated types of cells, whether it's red blood cells, whether it's neurons, whether it's muscles, and those differentiated cell types can go from individual cell types, and then they can unite together to perform a common function to form tissues. So you can have, for example, a muscle cell that groups together to make muscle tissues. And then you can have different tissues linking together to make organs. So for example, this kidney is composed of muscle tissue, nerve tissue, epithelial tissue, and connective tissue. And then this kidney performs a function used in the urinary system. So basically it's filtering out your urine. And then that kidney can join up with other organs. So for example, your bladder to make a whole organ system. And then that organ system helps out the entire organism, in that case, this chimpanzee that uses that organ system to help it urinate, along with, obviously, a bunch of other organisms. And so, once again, this ability to be multicellular, to have these differentiated specialized cell types that specialize and provide particular advantages to organisms for their survival is unique to the eukaryotes. This is a unique innovation that's only eukaryotes can do. So if there are all these advantages to multicellularity, why hasn't complex multicellularity evolved more than just 6 times? So it's evolved several times independently, so there must be advantages to it, but why don't we see lots of other multicellular groups out there? And that's what we'll address in our next lecture.